Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel, and today's video is going to be a little different. It's actually going to be a second attempt at a DIY I've done in the past. It was actually in the Pin Factor Fake series where I found a pin of rainbow roses that said to split the stem in 4 different ways and dip it in food coloring and it'll create our rainbow roses. If you didn't see that video, it was about 3 years ago. Here are the results. After 4 days there was little to no color in the roses and I said it was a fake pin. And then I did get a few comments, a handful of comments, letting me know to try floral dye as it is a thicker, more pigmented dye. So I thought, why not finally give that a try? So let's begin. Alright, so I'm starting with half a dozen long stem white roses, and the first thing we need to do is actually prepare them for the dyeing process. And to do that is just removing all of the foliage from the roses and then recutting the stems. And after recutting the stems, the roses stood about a foot tall. And of course you want to follow this step for each of your roses. And then one vital step you must follow is if your roses have been hydrating up to this point, meaning if they've been in a vase with water up to this point here, you actually want to wait 3 to 6 hours until you start the dyeing process. And that is because when you place your roses in the dye, it'll take a lot longer for the roses to start absorbing the dye. So the 3 to 6 hours allows them to kind of dehydrate, so when you do place them in that dye, it'll absorb it much quicker and faster, and that is exactly what we want. Alright, now that we have prepared our roses and they have been hydrating for the past 3 to 6 hours, we are ready to move on to the next step. So the next step is cutting our rose stems into 4 separate stems, and you want to work slowly and be very careful when doing this step. So I am using an X-Acto knife for this step just so that I have better control when it comes to cutting the stem, and I am cutting them about 2.5 to 3 inches from the bottom of the stem. And one other side note is when I first started working on this step, I would try to puncture the X-Acto knife from the top of the stem all the way to the cutting board, but I wasn't getting clean cuts, so instead of cutting it twice and creating the 4 separate stems, I ended up cutting the rose 4 different ways to then create 4 separate stems. Hope that makes sense. And just like that, we have created 4 separate stems, and each stem will actually be sitting in a different color of dye. Now here is a closer visual of the exact step that I just completed. Again, just working really slowly just so that you don't accidentally cut off one stem completely, then resulting instead of 4 colors, you have to then use 3 colors. So just work slowly on the step, and then you see I'm not puncturing it so that it reaches the other side of the cutting board, just enough to make a pretty thin incision, and then working my way around the rose and cutting it 4 separate times. And here you can see a closer look at the 4 separate stems that we just cut. And just like the previous step, you want to repeat this for each of your roses. Now if you accidentally have a slip of the hand and one of your stems come off and you have 3 instead of 4, you can definitely continue the dyeing process with, 3 colors instead of 4. or you can cut them a lot shorter. Don't do what I just did there. I don't know why I scratched myself with an X-Acto knife. Or, back to what I was saying, you can cut the stems that you just split and then split them once again, but just note when you continue the process, that rose will be a lot shorter than the others. After splitting each of my rose stems, one of the concerns that I then had was how much I butchered the inside of the rose stems. As you can see, well, right now it's a little blurry, hopefully I get something a little clearer, but you can see that the inside of the stems are pretty butchered. They're not nice, clean cuts, so I wasn't sure how well the dye would then be absorbed by the roses because of that, but I guess you have to keep watching to see if that affects our end result. And now we can finally start the dyeing process. So I will be using Absorbit Floral Dye. I think I bought them for about $12 each. Of course, I will link that down below. And we will be using the colors red, yellow, blue, and purple. And then we are going to continue following the directions on the back of the bottle for the following dyeing process. So up to this point, I have been following the directions in the back of the bottle just so that I could increase the percentage of actually succeeding in this DIY. And next is preparing the dye, which is using warm water and 2 to 3 teaspoons of the dye. So I have added a quart of warm water into 4 separate containers, then adding 3 teaspoons of one color into each container. Now that our dye has been mixed, it's time to prepare them for the rose stems. Now there are actually many ways to go about this step, but I found it easiest to use these 2x5 Ziploc bags, but I definitely have seen many different ways. Some people use shot glasses or just regular cups, but I just found it easiest to be able to maneuver the Ziploc bags. So you want to take 4 separate Ziploc bags and fill them with each of the dyes that we have just pre-made. So I fill each Ziploc bag a little over halfway, and just a warning, this step here can actually get really messy. So I don't know, it might just be me and I tend to get messy with all my DIYs, but just to be safe, line everything with plastic and use some hand gloves too, just because my hands were stained for a couple of days from this step here. Now that you have filled the Ziploc bag with one color, it's time to add the rose, and you just want to add 1 stem into each Ziploc bag. Now, one item I actually found extremely helpful for this DIY were clothespins. So not only did the clothespins help keep the rose standing tall and supporting itself and not toppling over, because that can happen and it will get messy and it will dye everything, and it's a lot of cleaning. I know, trust me. But another helpful thing about the clothespins is if you place them strategically and actually placing them lower by the Ziploc bags, it actually ensures that the rose stems are always filled with the dye, ensuring that it is always absorbing some of the liquid. Now remember how I said that this DIY can get messy? Well, lo and behold, some of my Ziploc bags actually had holes in them. So lucky for me, I did line everything with plastic, so it was an easy cleanup. But just again, fair warning, you might get holes in your Ziploc bags and this can get pretty ugly pretty fast. And there it is again. So once again, once you have filled each Ziploc bag with a different color, you just want to grab your rose and place one of the split stems into each Ziploc bag. And then you want to add your clothespins, placing them strategically so that it'll support the rose itself and keep it standing, as well as far enough down the Ziploc bag so that the dye is touching the rim of the rose so that it is always absorbing some dye. And if you think your Ziploc bags can use a little extra dye, just go back and add a little more. Just do it a little neater than I just did there. But you definitely want to use a heavy hand with the dye just to ensure that your roses are absorbing a lot of color. And lastly is ensuring you keep your roses in a cool area. I would suggest a fridge. I just didn't have the space for it, and also this can get pretty messy, so I just thought it'd be easier cleanup just in case anything did spill, which it did. So if you do use your fridge, make sure you line it with plastic or just be ready with your sponge and some wipes. So here I am just placing them in an ice chest filled with a bag of ice. Now this is the result of the roses sitting in the dye for about 30 minutes. It's a very faint color payoff, as you can tell, and I was starting to get a little worried just because the back of the bottle said to let them sit for about 30 minutes to an hour, and this just wasn't enough or a big enough result in my eyes. So I ended up leaving them in for about 3 to 4 hours, and of course I will show you that coming up. But another note was every time I checked on the roses, I did adjust the clothespin, lowering them deeper into the Ziploc bag, ensuring that the stems were always absorbing some of the dye. Now here are the roses after an hour of sitting in the dye, and you can see that the color is now coming up the stem a little more and it's a lot more visible than it was after 30 minutes. Now here are our roses after sitting in the dye for 2 hours. It's a lot better than the 1 hour mark, but it wasn't exactly where I wanted it to be, so I decided to leave it in the dye for another extra hour. Now here are our roses after sitting in the dye for 3 hours. It wasn't a big significant change compared to the 2 hours, so I thought it'd be a good time to pull them from the dye and start with the last step. Now here I'm just removing the roses from the dye, just ignore my hair there. And then the next step is just running the stems through water until they run clear, and then just place your roses in a vase with water and flower food. And here are just a couple of photos of the roses right after taking them out of the dye. And to be honest, At this point in the DIY, I wasn't all excited about it. I wasn't necessarily happy with the result I was receiving. Yes, of course, they are a different color, they're no longer white, but they weren't exactly the pictures I had seen either, so I wasn't exactly sold on this DIY. It wasn't actually until the following day of sitting in the water, as you see here, is the color started to kind of transfer through the petal, and it just wasn't at the ridge or like the rim of the petal. It was at this point that I started to get a little more excited about how they would look after another day of sitting in the water. And next is a series of photos comparing days 1, 2, 3, and 5. And as you can see on day 5, the roses are absolutely beautiful. Are they the result of the photos I've seen online? No, not necessarily, but I am still absolutely in love with this result. I think they are so gorgeous, and they're not as extremely pigmented as the photos, but they're more pastel-like, but I still love them. So I think this was a success of a DIY, to be honest. Maybe I can work on enhancing the color more. I'll just have to look into how to do that. But overall, I love this DIY. I absolutely loved the way the roses came out. Now keep in mind, the dyeing process is a lot of work and it takes a couple of days to see these kind of results, but if you have the time and patience, why not? These roses are just absolutely beautiful. Well, thanks for watching everyone, and please subscribe.